You're autistic, but what if that's not the whole story? What if your impulsivity, restlessness, and scattered focus aren't just quirks, but signs of ADHD? Although they're different, ADHD and autism can absolutely coexist. And sometimes those traits that don't quite fit your autism diagnosis, that's the ADHD talking. So today, I'll be reviewing signs of ADHD and how you can distinguish them from your autistic traits. Let's start with how your thoughts flow. ADHD thoughts move fast. You might start on one subject and suddenly derail into another without even realizing it. Conversely, autistic thinking is often structured and detail oriented. Now, it can still be hard to follow, especially as we delve into minor details or we're repetitive or we start info dumping, but it's different. It's not inherently scattered. If your internal monologue constantly outpaces your words or jumps unexpectedly, that could be ADHD in the background, especially if it's been hard to explain or even notice until now. Now let's talk about how you relate to time. Imagine you've got 5 minutes before you need to leave your house and you tell yourself that you'll be able to take the quickest of quick showers, throw on some clothes, and head out the door in time. But 20 minutes pass and you are still at home. That is time blindness. ADHD can distort your sense of how long things actually take. In fact, ADHD brains struggle to feel time at all. Autistic people, on the other hand, often manage time through structured routines. If time often slips away unnoticed or everything feels like it has to happen either right now or never, you're not alone. And that particular feeling tends to show up again and again in ADHD. Now let's shift into how motivation works. You know exactly how to do a task, but it feels impossible to start. Autistic people may avoid tasks because something is misaligned with routine. They may hesitate because a task is unfamiliar and unpredictable, making decisions related to that task overwhelming. This is known as autistic inertia. ADHD task avoidance can look similar, but the reason is often very different. In ADHD, the task may be too boring or not rewarding enough to activate action. Sometimes it's also about disrupted initiation and difficulty identifying a clear starting point. If you procrastinate, even when you're excited or motivated and only seem to get going when the pressure hits really hard, this might be one of the clearest signs that something else is at play. Now let's look at how memory plays into this. Have you ever walked into a room and completely forgot why you went in there? Now, this happens to everyone, including autistic people who can lose track of their thoughts when overstimulated. That in itself is not unique to being an ADHDer. However, if it happens frequently, even in calm or familiar situations, it may point to working memory difficulties. ADHD forgetfulness tends to strike even when the environment is stable because the brain doesn't reliably hold on to short term steps. If you find yourself losing pieces of tasks mid action or forgetting instructions the moment they're spoken, especially in neutral environments, it's worth noticing how often that pattern shows up. Now let's talk about emotional reactivity and what triggers it. Autistic people can be extremely emotional, but the response usually comes from dysregulation. When routines break or sensory input overwhelms, the nervous system can short circuit. That can look like crying, angry outbursts, or shutdowns. It's an involuntary system wide overload. ADHD emotional responses tend to come from impulsivity. A thought, a reaction, a burst of frustration or excitement can trigger immediate action often before the emotion is fully understood. Both responses are valid, but if your reactions feel sudden, fast, and confusing even to you, that difference can be a clue. Now let's talk about how you manage stillness. Autistic people often seek calm, quiet, or sensory control. ADHD brains often feel unsettled without stimulation. If you reach for background noise, cycle between screens, or multitask constantly just to stay engaged, that's not just habit. It's often how ADHD brains self regulate by chasing novelty. Now, let's talk about what happens when your focus gets interrupted. Autistic frustration often happens when routines are broken. ADHD frustration, on the other hand, tends to appear when momentum breaks, especially if you were finally focused. Let's say you're in the zone and someone asks this question or a notification pops up. You feel an immediate sense of irritation, not because you're angry, but because your mental rhythm got disrupted. That snap of frustration might seem small, but it's something many ADHDers recognize all too well. That's the cognitive cost of task switching when you're relying on momentum to stay engaged. And finally, let's look at follow through. Autistic people often wait to begin something until it's been fully mapped out. ADHDers tend to dive in quickly and then lose steam just as fast. If you frequently jump into projects and then leave them unfinished, not because they became overwhelming, but because your interest shifted or the payoff disappeared, that's a pattern often seen in ADHD. For some, noticing this disconnect is what finally makes things click, but for others, it's a different trait that doesn't quite fit their autism profile. And that's what opens the door. Either way, it's worth paying attention to the patterns that don't quite make sense because they might be pointing to something more. If your autism diagnosis explains your sensory or communication challenges, but not your impulsivity, energy, or how scattered you feel, there could be more to the story. Sometimes it's not just more autism, it's autism and ADHD. It's AuDHD. And that combo, it doesn't look like either one by itself. If any of this hit home, I'd love to hear how AuDHD shows up in you. Thank you so much for joining me today. I will see you next time.